This is something that is a major theme of my next book. So that, in other words, to show that we've had a kind of transnational revolution in the modern world during the 1980s and 1990s, I think, during which the major structures of power have become international. Think World Bank, think IMF, think NAFTA, think GATT. Legal structures, in other words. So, too, within the classified world, there have been transnational structures. Think, for example, the famous Echelon program run by America's NSA in collaboration with the NSA equivalents of Britain, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and probably other nations as well. They have and Echelon has its own legal structure that actually makes it independent of national laws. Isn't that nice? So the classified world has developed its own separate legal structure, and that translates into the UFO portion of the classified world. These are secret legal structures. People need to understand, like, for example, the National Security Agency's existence was unknown for nearly its first decade. It was not during the 1950s and into the 60s, the existence of the NSA was classified. And it was America's most powerful intelligence agency, and it was unknown. Similarly, the existence of the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office. For 30 years, the NRO's existence was classified. It was a felony for any member of Congress to mention the existence of the NRO. That's an astonishing reality. So what I'm saying is that we have a history in America of classified black operations. Do you suddenly think that that's going to end now? So now what we have is a classified legal structure. And I've had very good sources that have told me that a lot of this pertains to the UFO phenomenon.
When you said that the National Security Agency wasn't known until sometime in the 60s, what kind of flashed to my mind was, well, if by the 60s they were letting the cat out of the bag, that was because they had something behind it that was even bigger and even more nasty that's now the one that nobody knows about. Undoubtedly. These secrets come out when they become less important, less relevant. Not that the NSA is no longer important. It remains very important. But, of course, we still don't really know a lot about it, do we? No. Most of it's highly classified. But, I had one source, a high-level military liaison who told me of a congressional aide that he was very close with. This congressional aide was doing black budget analysis and concluded on the basis of his analysis that there is a massive black arm executive branch of the U.S. government that is totally classified, and that in this analyst's opinion was related to the UFO problem. I have it on another separate source that the amount of money that's gone into this is simply astonishing, and that actually that the security on the UFO problem was vastly more expensive than the actual scientific R&D, research and development. So like 7 or 8 times more money was spent on security, maintaining the secrecy of UFOs, than actually on the scientific study of it, which was an interesting little tidbit that I got along the way. Through the now 13 or 14 years of research and 2 books, what would be the cases that would come to mind that you would present to some of the skeptics, say in the 9/11 movement, or something? These people who consider themselves truth seekers, but for whom the UFO question is really, not on their radar at all. What cases would you suggest to them that they look at as examples of the better documented?
I would say cases and documents.
Cases and documents,
because they're, for example, one of the most important things that I would have any 9/11 researcher look at is the so-called Twining Memo of 1947. And this is not about a specific UFO case, but what it is a statement by a then 3-star general who later became a 4-star chief of staff of the Air Force, who in September 1947 wrote a 3-page memo describing the UFO phenomenon as it was then seen. One thing that Twining said in this memo is that based on the many military reports that were coming into Air Material Command at that time, that the UFO phenomenon was, quote, real, not visionary or fictitious. That's one explicit thing he said. Another thing Twining mentioned in this memo was a typical description of the many reports that they were getting, describing the objects as circular or elliptical in shape, round, domed on top and flat on bottom. It's right there in this memo. So in other words, what Twining was saying in 1947 was that there were enough detailed military descriptions of these UFOs to come up with that description. I mean, domed on top and flat on bottom. It's very explicit. Metallic in appearance, evasive maneuvers when sighted, normally no associated sound. In other words, what we can see is that as early as 1947, we have definitive proof that the U.S. military was taking the UFO phenomenon very seriously. Now, that in itself doesn't prove UFOs are alien, okay? But do we really need to prove UFOs are alien for them to be interesting, right?
Well, there's some people that would say that this is not Nazi technology that was being used, that there were a group of the Nazis that fled to Antarctica who were developing this technology, or maybe there were some of their scientists who came to the United States who developed those.
Sure. And guess what? Even if that is the truth, that's still worth looking into, because that phenomenon is still continuing to this day. And if you want to go with the Nazi explanation, then the only conclusion you can make is that there are Nazis right now in this world who are flying in flying saucers. And
is that a good thing?
So that's not a good thing either. So it's either the aliens or the Nazis or whoever, or some covert human group. No matter how you look at it, it's important. Mm-hmm. And so I think the problem that a lot of UFO skeptics, armchair skeptics or knee-jerk skeptics have is they jump too many steps ahead in the argument. In other words, this happens every time I deal with some skeptical person. I'll trot out a couple of good UFO cases, and immediately they jump ahead and say, well, UFOs are impossible because fill in the blank. The distances in space are too far. The truth would have come out by now, or whatever. In other words, they provide their own theoretical objections.
When they say the truth would have come out, I mean, what do they want as truth? The government coming out and saying, I mean, there's all this data, there's all this evidence.
Right.
The truth is out for crying out loud,
yes.
you know?
Because it doesn't come from an official source, and people are so
no, exactly
in awe of power and dependent on power. So.
To answer your question, though, Henry, as far as some good cases, there are some very, very good ones in the document history. There's a 1950 memo that I'm just thinking of off the top of my head from July of 1950 describing objects sighted over the Hanford Atomic Energy Commission plant in the state of Washington. A document stating that since July 30th, objects round in form have been seen over the Hanford AEC plant. The document then goes on to say that fighter squadrons, Air Force battalions, FBI, and others have been alerted to this. Investigation is ongoing. Of course, we don't have any document showing how that investigation concluded, but we know that there was an investigation there. There's another very amazing document that came out of Oak Ridge in 1953, the sighting of a black object coming out of the clouds, moving at a tremendous speed for 3 miles, where it stopped and then was joined by 2 other similar objects, which created a V formation and then flew off in a tremendous speed to the east and were gone. We have that document. I have an emergency memo from Maxwell Air Force Base in 1954 describing the intrusion of that Air Force Base's security by an unknown object that was seen and observed by a helicopter pilot at the base. There's a 1955 memo that I'm thinking of a radar plus visual by Pepperell Air Force Base for 29 minutes of an object that was seen visually and tracked on radar, of a flying saucer-shaped object. And so it goes. There's a very well-documented case from 1967 at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, in which a glowing object was reported by above-ground personnel, while below ground, at the exact same time, an Air Force captain named Robert Salas, a man that I know, reported and documented 10 nuclear missiles going offline instantly. Bing, 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 they all went down, while this object was hovering above. The documentation on this case is excellent, and in fact, Boeing, which owned the missiles, did its own study of why these missiles went offline and was unable to conclude. They had no explanation. It was.
Did they factor in the presence of this UFO?
No, they most certainly did not. So there was. In other words, I mean, I have no doubt that the Boeing personnel were aware that this had been reported.